Welcome back to the Electronics Inside, the show where we tear down tools, toys and appliances, just find out what's inside. I'm David, and in this episode, because everybody loved the laptops, we've gone older. The IBM 5155. Now, this keyboard, which is fully detachable, is based on the Model F IBM keyboard and is fully detachable thanks to these nifty little clips on the underside. And it's also connected using this, 6 pins, which makes that an RJ25 plug. But it's also a buckling spring keyboard, which means it feels fantastic and sounds amazing. Now, keyboards are great, but let's focus on the beast. It's got this beautiful built-in amber screen, which we've no idea if it works or not. And on the other side, we've got 2 floppy drives. Now, either one or both of these has been replaced. You can get this with one, you can get it with 2. 2 makes the most sense because you can boot an operating system from one and software from the other. But there were optional hard drives which also occupied the bottom bay. We don't know what this came with. It's got 2 non-identical drives. I'm not sure which of these 2 was the original, if any of them. And of course, at the rear, we've got the power supply, which is all of this, including the IBM. I feel like this is very IBM with the orange or red lever. And the expansion cards. The only one on here I can identify off the bat is the CGA graphics card. So you've got an external monitor CGA connector and a composite, because this could output composite as well. Not sure what these are, we'll have to get them open to find out. One thing I would like to point out is this cheeky little connector down here. Now, anybody that's familiar with IBM hardware can probably guess what this is. If you don't know, we'll save it till we're inside. But if you would like to, have a guess in the comments. I've deliberately kept this as is to sort of show everybody the condition it came in. It's looking quite good. There's no obvious signs of corrosion, damage, anything more than a bit of dirt. There is this worrying drip along here, which makes me think hopefully somebody just spilt something cosmetically on the outside as opposed to it's been under something that dripped on it for years. Again, untested, we've no idea what condition this is in. Aside from knowing that somebody has been in here to replace that floppy drive, we don't know if anything else has happened to it, but that floppy drive replacement could have happened in 1986 for all we know. So the 5155 is basically a version of the 5150 rammed into a portable case with a composite amber monitor. And this was a direct response to the Compaq, which was the first portable IBM compatible, and it was allegedly 100% IBM compatible on the market. And in the 1980s, IBM was the king. That was the big name to beat. It was called Big Blue for a reason. Okay, a little bit of dust, but otherwise it's looking quite positive. So inside, you've obviously got a lot of RF shielding. You've got monitor up front, power supply at the back, and the main computing space over here, all RF shielded from each other. Interestingly, I think the high voltage components for the monitor may be in the power supply. We have to take a closer look. So that big connector we could just about see from outside. This is what I was alluding to earlier. We now pull that off. You can see it's a proper PS2 connector for the keyboard. And it's just on this cable that runs on the underside of the computer round to the front to that RJ25 plug. So that was a very quick workaround rather than having to modify the motherboard for an internal header to accept the keyboard. I suppose if you've been beaten to market by a year by Compaq, then you have to make certain sacrifices to get there quickly. Okay, let's get the RF shielding off around the computer. Can I call it the computer? I hope so. Ooh, very, very light aluminium shielding. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, but a double stacked card. Got the main motherboard at the bottom with ISA connectors, 2 floppy drives. So that's the floppy drive controller. That's the one with the big, is that a D25 connector? No, I think it's a D37 connector on the bottom, on the back. Obviously, before conducting this teardown, I did the usual research to familiarise myself with the hardware and sort of the timeline building up to it and things like that. And what I found was absolutely fascinating, because I knew that this machine was a reaction to the Compact coming out. I think it was announced in '82 and released in '83. So they were a year behind even development on this product. Floppy disk controller. But what was interesting to me is that apparently the Compact is basically a complete rip-off of Xerox product. And I say product in the loosest possible term. Xerox had a research lab, and that is where they basically looked at offices, appliances and equipment and sort of said, what's the future of this? Where are we going to fit into this as a company? So this last card is the CGA graphics card. You pop off the internal composite connector for the graphics card. And you see this card is so long, it actually goes into these support slots at the front. There you go. So yeah, Xerox have got their research lab where they develop things to improve their own business. Apparently in the late 1970s, Xerox actually produced a portable computer, and it has a suspiciously familiar look. And it was the first portable computer of any kind, luggable, whatever you want to call them, it was the first, which is very interesting because if you recognize that story, it sounds very much like operating systems. And yes, this is mildly unsubstantiated, hearsay, anecdotal, whatever you want to call it. But the comment that Microsoft made, whether they copied Apple's operating system or not, was actually, no, we copied the Xerox operating system, which predated both. And I think there was some quote from Bill Gates saying we copied Apple would be like going to steal somebody's TV and finding somebody already carrying it out the door. Something like that anyway. But either way, portable computers appear to have gone the same way from Xerox. I think this card is actually not the original card, and I'm pretty sure this is a memory expander. I think the system could take up to came with 256K, but could support up to 512K. And I think this is the memory, which goes in the ISA slot, but it's not the original, which is good news, because I think the original, complete with bodge wire, I think the original actually had an onboard battery which leaked. Obviously not desirable. How do you get the floppy disks out? Carefully, I'm guessing. So take the connectors off. Molex, the ever-present Molex. Can't build anything without a good Molex connector. There's the floppy ribbon with the twist for the secondary drive. Okay, so floppy disk number, or floppy drive number 1. Ooh, feeling a bit crusty. To me, I think is possibly the aftermarket drive. There is the other floppy drive. Ooh, belt-driven floppy drive with a tachometer on it. Do I mean tachometer? I think I do. So when this is spinning up to speed, you can put a little infrared sensor that will count the pulses, and it will give you a clear indication of the speed that this is running at. Don't really see why AC would be coming to the floppy drive though, because the power supply and the Molex connectors only have yellow and red, which are 12 volt and 5 volt DC. So why would 50 Hz and 60 Hz be applicable to a floppy drive? Unless it's clocked to the CPU in the region, which is something I didn't know about. The floppy drives have PAL and NTSC equivalent of? I've just answered the question. The top drive was the aftermarket drive, because what I hadn't noticed is they've modified the front. So that's actually a moulded part of the front case. So how does one get the motherboard out? So here we have a beautiful, very old motherboard. So you can see AMD chips all over this, including the 8088 processor from 1982 made by AMD. There's that nice little angled screw socket that you could get to through the floppy drive. And one of the things I really like about this board is you can see the ISA, the industry standard adapter. You can see all those conductors that run straight down and how these are all connected directly to the same bus, which means you have to be able to address each of these on the same bus. So they all have to be fitted with their own individual interrupt requests. And I don't know if I'm going to find it, but I would think on cards like this, you probably have an address jumper or dip switches like that, maybe, that would set the address so they didn't clash with each other. And over here you have the banks of memory, bank 0, 1, 2 and 3, and that would have been your base 256K. They all look the same, they all look reasonably original. I'm sure that's going to be a really fun job of reseating all of those if you have a memory issue. I'm not sure off the top of my head without looking it up what this additional socket's for. I would think this is probably an ALU expansion, an arithmetic logic unit. So that helps improve the processing speed when you're doing floating point operations, I think. I'll look that up and check it. Interesting over here that we have a single socketed IC, whereas all the rest are directly soldered. Now, is that an aftermarket job or is that something that's factory settable? Let's have a quick look at the soldering underneath, and it looks absolutely impeccable. So I would think that was factory fitted, probably an option, may even be the difference between PAL and NTSC, because a lot of this is driving the monitor directly, and this is the US version of this piece of hardware. I can't see any obviously failed capacitors, any failed components. I understand these caps that sit on the 12 volt bus can be questionable, but so far so good. So I think next we'll put all this to one side and go after the power supply. Interestingly enough, these screws are actually the tamper resistant torque screws. They've got the little dimple in the center. For anybody keeping score, that is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5th type of connector or screw head for this machine. But I guess when it costs the equivalent of $10,000 today, it's something you probably looked after and repaired, and we're grateful for a lot of screws rather than glue. Okay, that's better. Yeah, extra shield on the bottom, but of course they're willing to run it through the compartment that has the high voltage supply for the CRT. Makes absolute sense. Chassis and CRT, power supply. So this is my next big moment. Hopefully everything on here is going to look happy and willing to cooperate. No leaking capacitors, no life-threatening terminal illnesses for it, but we're only going to find out one way. Well, actually that's not quite true. There are two ways we could find out. The other way is wasteful, and I don't really want to try it. So obviously we've got a fan attached here on P13. And we've got this wonderful little description of P1 and P12, 1 and 2 are ground and 12 volts. So that's the power for the CRT as far as I can work out. Yeah, surprised it only runs on 12 volts. I wondered if that was going to be mains pass through. This has had a bit of a dirty life, but at least it seems to be electronically looked after. Definitely not seeing any signs of issues anywhere. If we plug everything in later, we might try the power supply unloaded, just to make sure nothing nasty happens, but we'll definitely give it a clean up before we put any power on it. So the last part that makes this machine up is of course the CRT. Again, this hasn't been turned on in a very, very long time. I've had it for a number of weeks, not turned it on. Nothing in here should be charged. Solder's untested, so I'm pretty confident that everything in here is going to be discharged. And that's just for me to remove the screen so I can discharge it, just in case. So this sticker that fell off when I first opened the case has clearly come off the monitor. Now it says 13 volts, 1.4 amps. Not a problem. Except for the fact the power supply, that connector said 12 volts, 1.5 amps. So 13 at 1.4 is about 18 watts. So we're still getting the same power draw, but a differential voltage. Clearly wasn't enough of an issue to cause an operation problem. So let's pop off the shielding. I love this little tension detail on the front. It's like a Jubilee clip or something. If you didn't know about CRTs, go watch the iMac G3 video, talk about it in a bit more detail, and that sticker alone should be enough to warn you why. So here is the CRT. It's largely ordinary. You know, there's not a lot here that you wouldn't expect in any CRT, other than the fact it's 12 or 13-ish volts. You've got the signal in, which is composite, which is coming down this nice little twisted pair of wires, and your external brightness and contrast settings. Otherwise, it's a neat little self-contained unit. Again, it's could do with a bit of a clean, but otherwise it looks in fantastic shape. All the electronics, all the capacitors I can see look good. So I think this is really a case of clean it up, put it back together, cross your fingers. Okay, so here is the motherboard. Now earlier I said this is the processor, which sure enough it is. And I guess that was an ALU support chip, but it's just a coprocessor, so that'd be any 8087 coprocessor can go in that socket. So up here we have a 8x8-bit and a 32K by 8-bit ROM. Now those together make up the BIOS. You notice they're actually IBM stamped. I'm pretty sure that these are the two bits that made the IBM clone legally very challenging, because that's what had to be reverse engineered. Now the rest of the board is just made up of everything you'd expect to make a computer work. Now in this corner down here, this is all the base memory. Now you can see that it actually goes in banks. So you can go bank 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and down here of course it tells you can have 64 to 256 kilobyte system memory. So depending on how many banks you occupy is how much memory you have on the motherboard. And then again you've got this beautiful ISA industry standard adapter bus. And on the reverse of the board you've got all the horizontal traces, and on the front all the vertical traces. Some of the expansion cards we have here. So this one is the parallel port. This is sort of paired up with the MDA, the monochrome display adapter, which is over there. And this kind of went as a standard together. And this also only worked as an expansion card with some motherboards. Some of the motherboards actually had a parallel port built in, and this couldn't be used in there because it would clash with the address, the IRQ address. So this is the floppy disk controller, and you've got the internal connection to the drives here, your ISA adapter down here, and then you can have external connections to your storage on the D25. No, it's a D37 on the back. That's all that does. This is the monochrome display adapter. This is the really long card. And this handles, and that can actually output a CGA color signal, but using that onboard connector just up here, it outputs in composite to the internal monitor. And I don't know why, but I find it really weird. Like up here, all the traces have just got such sharp angles on them. That's something you don't normally see. They don't normally have sort of rounded or filleted sort of 45-degree traces. So having those 90-degree ones is a little bit odd. This card is an interesting one because it's got a serial port on it, but this is also memory expansion. So this will get you up to, I believe, 512K of memory. Now most of this is just laid out in banks, just like it is on the motherboard, and you can see it's a double card. It's got this little expansion header which I've already separated, just so I can lift this off and show you the peripheral connector. Each of the ICs down here are actually piggybacking. And I don't know why you do that, because like I say, you can't address both of these separately. So you're not gaining in memory. I guess you're gaining in resilience. If one chip fails, would that give you some sort of failover ability? Or would one corrupting corrupt the signal, in which case I still don't get it. Why would you do this? I can't see it. Please let me know in the comments over Element 14. I'd love to know why you do this. Okay, sometime later, I've got the power supply reassembled with the CRT just because I kind of wanted the shielding around everything. The cable powering the CRT is disconnected, so at the moment I just want to dry test the PSU with nothing connected to it, no load. I have remembered to flick the switch to 230 volts because this was actually imported from the States and set to 110 volts. So let's put my IEC lead in, make sure it's switched on, and listen out for any pops. Okay. Sounds good. So next up, the next step in the testing procedure is get the motherboard in and the graphics card in and get the monitor hooked up. That's the bare minimum needed to get it working, and then we'll add cards and add the floppy drives and things like that one by one, see how much of this we can get working. Power's hooked up, motherboard is in, graphics card or the CGA card is in, hooked up to the monitor. Fingers crossed, this should be catastrophic or fantastic. Well, I feel like that was very uneventful. Maybe a good thing, but it doesn't sound like the monitor's switched on, which means I think the power supply is probably not happy. this is a bit of a shame because it would be really nice to get this working. I'm getting that smell of capacitors, and I've checked, I'm getting no voltage out of the PSU. It would be great to get this working, so keep your eyes open on the Element 14 community for a recap episode again. Hopefully we can get it back to some kind of working condition. Nothing else looks like it's got any issues, so we'll give it our best. The machine itself is a bit kind of disappointing. The early portables, this one the compact included, they just are normal PCs rammed into a portable form factor. I mean, it's the motherboard without modification, peripherals are no difference. It's just an all-in-one case with an 8-inch CRT. It's not very imaginative. And it was only a year or so after this you started to see some interesting LCD-based portables, something which we would more consider to be a laptop than a luggable. If you'd like to see more on the history of PCs, or if you've got an idea for a teardown of your own, let me know over at the Element 14 community at element14.com/the electronics inside. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.